Our final presentation of this first session is Martin Norris, who we're very grateful to him for his work on the Facebook page that maybe many of you have found us through. So yes, thank you for that. But he's going to talk about Burton personally, and we had quite an interesting conversation yesterday about the content, but I think maybe I'll leave it to Martin to let that unfold as nature would, as it would naturally. So thank you, Martin, and thank you very much.
Okay. Sir Richard Francis Burton had a superstition. He felt that if ever something terrible was going to happen, then it would probably be on Friday. There is my talk. It's a selective look at some of the diseases, maladies and misfortunes that Burton suffered during his life. Conversely, it will also give an indication of just how robust he was in mind and body, for what he survived killed off many of those around him. Born in Torquay in 1821, he spent the first 5 years of his life in England before his family relocated to France. About a third of Victorian children had died by the age of 5, so for him the race of life had started and he was already ahead. Early childhood in France saw him developing into a wild child with a fierce temper. He formed a gang of similar urchins to terrorise the neighbourhood, and particularly enjoyed smashing the windows on the local church. Now he was aged 9 and he needed to be tamed and fashioned into being a proper English gentleman. So he was sent back to attend a prep school in Richmond, just outside of London. Burton hated everything about the school, and an outbreak of measles that spread amongst the boys only compounded his misery. But then, to his great delight, the outbreak caused it to be shut down, though only after several of the pupils had died. The timing of this was fortunate, as Burton's father wanted the family to return to the continent. So, with private tutors employed, the family and new entourage moved to France, then Italy, and finally settled in Naples, just ahead of the world cholera epidemic that arrived there in 1833. Cholera is spread through sewage and contaminated water, and in this densely populated city it took a strong hold. Now, the sensible thing to do was to stay indoors and not enter the filthy streets. But that was not for the young Burton nor his brother Edward. They felt it would be far more exciting to sneak out and see what was happening. They dressed themselves up as undertakers' assistants and ventured out. In their disguises, they were able to follow the carts transporting the bodies to the edge of the city. There they would stare in terrible fascination as the stiff black corpses were dropped into a huge steaming pit. Cholera could take a few days to manifest itself, and not long afterwards, Burton's mother saw him return home. He was deathly pale with blank staring eyes, the early symptoms of this disease. Hearing her anguished voice, Burton's father rushed into the room to see what the commotion was about. He only needed one look at his teenage son to see that he was perfectly fit and well, but just blind drunk. 1842, and it came time for the 21-year-old to start to make his way in the world. Burton wanted adventure, and after managing to ruin his chances of entering the church or academia, he succeeded in joining the army, receiving a commission into the Bombay Infantry of the East India Company. It was usual for new arrivals in India to experience Delhi belly, and no sooner had he arrived than he too was struck down with a severe case of diarrhea. The military doctor prescribed some excellent port as a suitable cure, and once he recovered, Burton reasoned that if it was an effective cure, then one could assume it could also be used as a preventative. From then on, while his fellow officers tucked into a feast at breakfast, he would drink fine port and eat a biscuit. His enthusiastic intake of this rich wine would eventually contribute to the painful gout that he suffered later in life. For now, though, his foot was just badly injured when the monsoon rain caused his mud bungalow to collapse on top of him, and it was many months before he could walk without a limp. 1846 and the cholera that was sweeping the world arrived at his new post in Karachi, killing 60,000 locals and 600 British soldiers. This time, Burton wasn't spared in the epidemic, and his case of cholera was deemed severe enough for him to be granted a 2-year leave. And he was sent to recover at the military sanatorium in Uttarakhand. There is, however, strong reason to suspect that while he may have been ill earlier in that year, he was now completely recovered and was expertly faking a poor condition so that he could take some time off to explore the country. He certainly seemed in no hurry to begin his convalescence, for on the way south, he stopped for 6 weeks in Gout, the old Portuguese colony on the coast. Here, Burton gathered much of the material for his first book, Gout and the Blue Mountains. As part of his research, he visited the Santa Monica convent in the town. It contained not only lifetime nuns, but also temporary ones, well-born ladies whose husbands were away on military campaigns, held inside the walls that acted as an architectural chastity belt. Burton met an attractive and rather keen young woman there, and he decided to conduct a raid on the convent to temporarily abduct her. No picture exists, but I like to think that she looks something like this. The clandestine extraction was rather hastily conducted in the night, but his plan worked beautifully, up to the point where he uncovered his human package and discovered that in the dark he had instead mistakenly wrapped up the elderly Mother Superior. The hospital in Ooty, or Little England, was high up in the Nilgiri Mountains. It was also a resort where the English officers and their families retreated every year to escape the hot summers on the plain below. It wasn't long after Burton arrived, then so too did the monsoon. And that was the signal that it was now cool enough on the plains for the healthy English residents to descend back down. This just left the company of 104 other officers on sick leave and only a few unattached women. Not much chance of a stimulating life now. And to compound the boredom in the now rather empty hill station, he also developed ophthalmia, a severe eye irritation with occasional bouts of blindness that would go on to trouble him for years. The application of a mercury ointment only made the condition worse. Burton didn't stay long at Ooty, leaving just 6 months into his 2-year convalescence. His brief stay had given him time to pursue his Arabic studies, and they had fired his imagination. With declining career opportunities and little chance of adventure in India, he set his sights on undertaking a Hajj to Mecca, a pilgrimage to the centre of Islam. It was a very dangerous journey for a non-Muslim. He would need not only a good disguise, but also a fulfillment of the physical appearance of a Muslim. He would need to be circumcised. And this was probably done near to the end of his time in India. It's a procedure that even today for an adult man is not without risk, but in mitigation, the risk of discovery as an infidel would almost certainly have been far, far worse. This is an Indian circumcision knife from the period, which looks a little rusty to me. He suffered further issues in his groin later on. Orchitis, an infection often caused by a sexually transmitted disease, it left him with a swollen testicle and intense stabbing pain. However, in 1854, an even more serious affliction awaited him on the east coast of Africa in Somalia. It was probably here that he contracted syphilis. It wasn't an uncommon disease in the 19th century. Young men released from a chaste Victorian England, when presented with an abundance of very exotic and available partners, could lose restraint. All the government could do was to try and encourage chastity with a warning health campaign. 2 minutes with Venus, 2 years with Mercury. Penicillin can cure it nowadays, but that wasn't due to be discovered for another 70 years. And so it was with this traditional remedy of treating oneself with mercury pills that Burton probably resorted to. He always carried them for his eye problems anyway, though we now know that they contained 6,000 times the recommended daily exposure. Syphilis goes through 4 stages. Firstly, a small sore forms, which disappears after a few weeks. It may now seem to be cured, but it is just quietly incubating for the second phase. This erupts a few months later as a rash on the body, accompanied by headaches, fever, hair loss, and swollen glands. Within a year, these symptoms will also disappear. Then the third stage follows, which can last for 2 decades. Although after a couple of years, it can no longer be transmitted, during most of this phase, there are no outward signs. But inside the body, the disease will be wreaking havoc on the organs. Not everyone passes to the 4th and final stage, but those who do experience brain, heart, and nerve damage, seizures, blindness, and dementia. Now, I won't speak about Burton's first expedition to find the source of the Nile in 1855, as Joe Butler, I believe, is speaking next on this period. But I will just mention about Burton and how he came to receive his facial scars. Just have a look at this Somali warrior with his spear, and imagine being woken at night by dozens like him all trying to kill you. That spear is hurled out of the darkness and into your head. You feel it piercing both cheeks, knocking out some teeth and fusing your mouth shut. Then picture yourself staggering around for 2 hours with your head impaled on this 6-foot javelin. You spend the time trying to hide, knowing your attackers are out there looking for you. Finally, you find a friend who very kindly severs the wooden shaft and pulls the barbed metal head out through your right cheek. 2 years later, in 1857, Burton and Speke set out again to find the Nile's source. Almost immediately, they come down with malaria. Burton suffered fits and delirium so intense he believed he could fly. But he still managed to do 118 miles in 18 days. Edward Rice, in his biography, claimed that these fevers actually cured Burton of his syphilis. It's unlikely, but not impossible. Burton was now so crippled that he had to be carried on a donkey, but then the tsetse fly killed all their beasts. So he hobbled on crutches with swollen feet, still determined to achieve at least 4 miles a day. His expedition was traversing Africa westwards towards Lake Tanganyika. They badly needed some rest, so paused at the Arab trading post of Kazan. Burton was now too ill to even stand and spent days lying in a hut without moving. This building still remains. It's called David Livingstone's home, after the missionary who later lived there. The small gold plaque on the left of the doorway commemorates the stay of Burton and Speke. He took various cures, but nothing seemed to help him. He even tried the Bedouin cure of cauterizing the skin with a red-hot iron, but that still didn't improve his strength. Despite his body becoming even weaker, he rose up and pressed on. It was brave but foolish, and not long after leaving Kazan, Burton collapsed with paralysis in all of his limbs. Unable to walk or even write, he was carried by porters, and it would be almost a year before he could walk properly again. Months later, they finally reached Lake Tanganyika. Burton was almost blind and could do nothing but lie in bed and get stoned on the opium he carried. In the meantime, Speke recovered from his fevers and went off to discover Lake Victoria as the source of the Nile, all by himself, which was rather impertinent, and Burton would like to have told him just that, but his tongue had become so ulcerated that he couldn't speak, and he had to live on milk for 17 days. With continuing ill health and depleted supplies, they were forced to give up any further exploration and return to England. When he eventually returned home, some months later, Isabel described him as having had 21 attacks of fever, had become partially paralysed and was half blind. He was a mere skeleton with brown-yellow teeth, brown-yellow skin hanging in bags, his eyes protruding and his lips drawn from his teeth. But never did I feel the strength of his love as then. Burton became the British Consul of Fernando Po in 1862, a small island off the west coast of Africa, now called Bioko, a place where typhus and yellow fever could sweep across the land, taking many of the white population to their grave. Burton protected himself by drinking a flask of brandy every day, claiming, "In dangerous tropical regions, he dies first who drinks water." The other significant risk to health were the poisonous snakes living in the trees. The indigenous Bubi people were not in the habit of wearing any clothes, but they always kept their hats on to protect themselves from any falling reptiles. So did Burton. An 1868 trip to Brazil with his wife ended with hepatitis and pneumonia. He could not move or swallow without screaming in pain for 15 minutes, and he now seemed to be dying. A doctor prescribed leeches and cupping and put a large blister on his side, from which he drew out an immense amount of black clotted blood. While Isabel bathed his head with holy water and prayed for him, Burton drank chlorodyne, which contained opium, cannabis and chloroform. You can still buy it today. It's called Collis Brown's mixture, although the cannabis has been removed and there remain only traces of opium. Life in the tropics takes its toll on one's health. Burton now looked closer to 60 than his 47 years. He had a 2-inch cyst removed from the back of his shoulder in 1872. The doctor cut it out without using any anaesthetic, while Burton calmly sat on a chair. But his penchant for proving his hardiness could sometimes backfire. On a mountaineering trip in Germany, while his companions slept in the warm hut, he decided to sleep outside in the snow and caught a chill, which became an MRSI-like infection. This settled in his groin and a tumour formed. It was another long illness that eventually needed 2 operations, the second under chloroform, while the doctor cut a 3-inch diameter hole. An hour later, Burton was sitting up with a brandy and soda and smoking a cigar. 1883, and Burton moved into his final home in Trieste. It was a very cold house, and he wrote while wearing a fur coat as the metal arms of his chair rusted in the damp air. He was in physical decline, weak and with gouts so painful on his feet that he would faint and sometimes lose the use of his legs. The following year, he had a mild heart attack, and a few years later in Cannes, a stroke, convulsions, and then a major heart attack that seemed terminal. Isabel again knelt and baptized him and said some prayers, but a short time later, he opened his eyes and said, "Hello, there's the lunch bell. I want my lunch." This was now the start of his life as a semi-invalid. The last few years of his life were a whirl of travel, writing and declining health. His niece, Georgina, met him in England in 1888 and was horrified by his appearance. Heart disease was making rapid progress. The least exercise made him short of breath and his memory was failing. The writer, Mary Lovell, consulted some doctors for her biography, Arranged to Live. Their opinion was that Burton was experiencing the fourth and final stages of syphilis. On the 18th of October, he translated the last page of The Scented Garden and retired to bed after supper. Pain from his gout kept waking him during the night until he suffered a massive and final heart attack. He died on this day 133 years and 4 hours ago. Thank you.
I'm sure there's a health moral there somewhere. I don't think you can begin to hazard a guess as to what it is.